Hello everybody. So as you can see, I'm out in the woods today, and we're doing a topic that I always mean to do a video on, but I never seem to get around to. And that's the topic of economics. People ask me about it and something else more interesting comes up. So I guess to start off with, I don't really subscribe to any, systematic interpretation of economics. If that makes sense. Like, I don't really subscribe to the Austrian school or to traditionalist guild system or socialism or ANCAP or kind of anything like that. My views tend to be a little more, I don't know if conventional or centrist is the right way of putting it, but not particularly extreme or radical. And part of that is, I think of economics, like a lot of aspects of public policy, is to a large extent like a technocratic or professional, I don't really like using the term scientific, but I'm sure you know what I mean, field, that a lot of it really depends upon the situation, the factors involved. The answer, it depends, matters a lot when you're dealing with economics. The thing that I think people fail to understand, though, and this is true of any kind of public policy thing, is economics doesn't really tell us anything from a moral standpoint. It doesn't say this is good, this is bad. It's just we put in inputs and we get outputs. And we can use economic theory to predict what the impact will be. But ultimately, it's about what your goals are, what your presumptions are, and what you value. Like, raising the minimum wage will probably increase unemployment, but you may think that's a reasonable trade-off to put more people above the poverty line or something like that. Economics doesn't really tell you one way or another how that works. On the other hand, you can say we want to tax the rich more to fund social programs, and economics might tell you that if you do that, rich people are going to leave the country and it's going to result in a net loss to the economy and more people will lose their jobs than jobs are made. So I think a lot of it is very situational, and a lot of it depends very much on what you bring into it. That's kind of what I mean by it being a somewhat technocratic thing based on the particular situation. So that being said, what are kind of some of the principles I think of? Firstly, markets work. The fact that you sometimes have market failures or things get out of control or materialism develops or any of that stuff doesn't really get rid of the basic fact that market economies function and planned economies don't. I mean, the fact that in general, in a market economy, if people need something, I think it's called spontaneous order or the invisible hand or whatever, but something will probably emerge to fill that need. And the price will be based upon what people are willing or able to pay. Now, sometimes that's too high for most people, or sometimes it's too low for the person to make money. But generally speaking, in a market economy, there is the equilibrium of supply and demand and price. And once again, there's market failures, there's stuff like monopolies, there's people who try to cheat you, but like if there's a street corner and people there want coffee, a coffee shop's probably going to show up there. People who worked in office buildings or go to skating rinks or whatever want a snack, so the vending machines just kind of got invented. If there's a marina or you're by the ocean, there's probably going to be someone there selling boat parts and fishing gear and night crawlers and worms and stuff. The profit motive does drive spontaneous order, and it does do a reasonably good job of allocating resources in the most efficient way. And this kind of brings us to the whole capitalism question. I don't know if there's really an exact definition of what capitalism means. I like to cite a lot what John Paul II said when he was asked about capitalism. He said, the church's position on capitalism, if by that you mean a market economy, a business economy, or a free economy, where people have a degree of economic freedom, private property rights are protected, and the economy isn't centrally planned, then that's very compatible with church teaching. If you're talking about it as a materialistic society under which profit is the sole measure of human value, then that's anathema to the church. So if you want to talk about capitalism as being a market economy where by and large supply and demand sets price, then I guess you could say I'm a capitalist. But if you want to say it's like completely free market, whatever that means, where there's no government intervention and money's the only thing that matters, that's also not accurate. And I don't know, maybe this is kind of boring or vanilla or whatever, but I find people like to get into kind of outlandish new systems when generally speaking it functions okay. Once again, there's a lot of problems, but I think by and large it's not it's the best, it's the least bad system we've come up with. As we've seen from the Soviet Union, central planning doesn't work. As we've seen in Latin America, excessively overly subsidized economies don't work. You need some form of market. Now, that being said, government intervention in the economy also works. It's this, like, I think for me, something that was kind of a foundational thing in my economic views comes from something called the American School, which was mostly founded by Alexander Hamilton. And that was the idea that the role of the government is to create good conditions for businesses to develop and thrive. So rather than the government necessarily, the term is picking winners or losers or directly funding private enterprises, what the government should do is try to make good conditions that private business can do its thing. So the principles that Hamilton came up with were investments in infrastructure, sound money, strong private property rights and enforcement of contracts through the courts, protective tariffs, and eventually what was added to that was investments in education and research funding. And the idea being was those things kind of put together creates a good environment for people to develop businesses. And generally speaking, these things work. I mean, it just kind of makes sense. If there's good roads, there's good transit. In the older days, it was canals. If these things exist, then businesses can use them. They can more easily transport goods. If there's roads, you can have private buses or private transit that brings people around. Having working electrical grid and working water dramatically simplifies things. Even stuff like having basic standards helps out in terms of economies of scale, so that most businesses can use kind of standardized things. I don't know if light bulbs would be an example of that, but just kind of things like that. So that's one thing. Investments of education, I think, generally speaking, work. I don't know how realistic it really is for everyone to provide private education to their children, or to homeschool everyone. I mean, it might be possible. I definitely am open to things like charter schools and vouchers. But I do think government has a role to ensure that there's a minimum standard of education. Now, rather that's to grade 8 or to grade 12 or grade 10, that's arguable, but generally speaking, it is of immense helpfulness to society if everyone can read and write, do basic math, have a basic understanding of how government functions, how the world functions. These things are all very important. When writing was first invented, it was immediately extremely valuable. For the simple reason that it allowed people to keep business records. Like you have a warehouse, even back then, and you have a tablet that says, okay, X tons of wheat are in here, etc. That stuff is extremely important. Likewise, basic mathematics are very important. I think they need to teach more practical skills like maybe home repair or personal finance or something, but that's good. I also think it is important that government help out in terms of expensive post-secondary education. I think to a certain extent to help meet the needs the economy has. Like if there's a shortage of tradesmen, then I think the government can help to solve that, not by bringing in like a ton of immigrants, but providing more subsidies and incentives for people to go into that area. People getting degrees in science, people getting degrees in something practical like, I don't know, nursing, or even something like bookkeeping or mechanics or something like that. I do think there is a place for government funding of liberal arts and social sciences. The issue is that it's massively oversaturated, but that's something we can talk about another time. But I do think a well-educated population is an economically productive one. So we have that. Sound money, I think that makes sense. You have to keep the inflation rate reasonable. You have to keep interest rates reasonable. Once again, that's very that's open to interpretation. Like sometimes you have to raise interest rates, maybe to discourage people from taking out unrealistic amounts of debt. But once again, I see that as kind of a technocratic thing that you have to take on a case-by-case basis and that sort of thing. So I hope that kind of makes sense. Sound money is kind of where I get into some distributist ideas. I don't think the idea of distributism necessarily should be limited to just land or farming or things like that. I do think property ownership is a good thing. I think it's good if people have savings or a house or something like that, if for no other reason than it gives people a stake in the country. If you own a house or you own stocks or government bonds or business, you have a stake in the future of your country. You have a stake in it prospering, of it being, of the law being upheld so your property rights can be respected. If for no other reason than that, and while there's certainly a role for government in providing welfare and providing for its citizens, ideally it would be better as much as possible if families can take care of themselves. Because as I maintain, the family is the base unit of society. Families precede the government. So, and this is kind of, not to get into too much of a tangent, but this is kind of when I get irritated when people give adult children, if you want to use that term, crap, because when they're down on their luck a bit and they move back in with their parents. I mean, the alternative, if they're looking for a job, I don't know, they either burn through all their savings, run up debt, or go on a government program. So like, is it really better for taxpayers to fund them than their parents to fund them? And I mean, I don't know, generally speaking, I think that's better. But one of the problems we have is we have too much inflation, or interest rates are too low, and we discourage people from saving, and we encourage people to take out too much debt. So I think it should be a goal, and I like things like TFSAs and RRSPs, or whatever you call them in the States. But I think it's good to encourage individual property ownership for a variety of reasons, if for no other reason than it gives people a stake in the society. So there's sound money. Property rights are once again a pretty straightforward one. You're not gonna work hard or value things if the government can just take them from you. Obviously, the government sometimes has to nationalize things or charge taxes, but it has to be done in like a legal and fair way. If you live in a society where the government can just knock down your door and steal your house and steal your money, not only are people not going to want to work hard, but no one would want to start a business. Why would you start a business if at any time it can be just shut down? Foreign countries don't want to operate in countries that do stuff like that. Sorry, foreign companies, people don't want to invest, people don't want to buy from you. I mean, at a very basic level, if we want to get back to Christianity, I mean, one of the 10 commandments is thou shalt not steal. And thou shalt not covet. So taking something from someone just because they're rich or just because they're poor is wrong. Then we move on to something like tariffs. Now, the thing with tariffs is you have to be very careful with them. It's very much a meme that American industrialization was achieved through laissez-faire policies. America had a fairly strong protectionist scheme or protectionist administration for most of its early times. I think up to like the post-World War II era. There might have been a gap in the 20s or 10s or something where there was more free trade. But America's always had tariffs. And that was primarily, I believe, before income tax was introduced, how the government funded things was that in excise taxes. So here's how tariffs are supposed to be used. I think there's two main contexts for tariffs. The first one is to develop infant industries. That is, like in America, when industries were first getting started, like textiles or steel or something like that, they don't have the institutional experience, they don't have the economies of scale, they don't have the capital, they don't have the horizontal and vertical integration that companies in Britain would have. So it makes sense to have tariffs that allow the American steel or textile manufacturers to compete with Britain and allow them to run a profitable business. The idea being that as they expand, as they ramp their production up, they get their economies of scale going, they get their distribution systems, you gradually lower the tariffs. So they aren't just kind of getting a free subsidy anymore. They can now compete with Britain, and they have to be more efficient and operate according to the market. But that's kind of the purpose of the tariff, is to not permanently shield all internal stuff from competition, but to allow the industry to develop. Now, it's kind of used improperly because in some cases the government will put tariffs on things that really can't be produced domestically. Like, we can't really grow tropical fruit in Canada. I mean, I guess in greenhouses or something, but there just isn't really a point to it. And I'm sure there's all kinds of different things where it's just very inefficient to make it. It's not a necessary good, that kind of thing. The other area where tariffs, I think, have a place is when it comes to strategic industries. Industries that the state and the nation have a direct need for. So, for instance, while not all countries can be food self-sufficient, I do think it's necessary to put tariffs on food production so your country at least produces some of it. Same thing with things like medical supplies, at least some steel or industrial goods, so that if you have a situation like what we had last year, where the global economy kind of breaks down, countries can at least replace some of their imports till the situation stabilizes. Like Canada and America probably, if we really tried, could become self-sufficient in most materials. We'd probably have to stop eating certain foods or stop using goods made with certain materials that aren't really that available here. But they could probably provide for themselves industrially in terms of food or something like that. Japan was briefly self-sufficient in terms of rice, but it required an absurdly high amount of subsidies and tariffs. In particular, a problem that Canada ran into during the COVID thing is we had allowed our vaccine production to be exported to India or America. And so when countries were starting to panic to make the vaccine, the US and a lot of other countries said, well, our citizens come first. Our national interest comes first. So you can buy the vaccines after everyone here gets vaccinated. And then Canada was just kind of screwed because we had allowed our industrial production to go to other countries. So that's the other case. I think getting back maybe to the education thing a bit, I think government investment in research and development is good. I think things like NASA or some other large-scale technology projects that the government provides additional funding for, or basic research or things like that, are very valuable because there might not always be an explicit private sector incentive for it, and there tends to be a lot of benefits elsewhere. Plus, I just generally like technology. I think it gives people something to focus on, and it kind of stokes the imagination and stuff like that. So, yeah, so where was I? So I went through tariffs. I guess kind of beyond that, when things like if the government wants to invest in a specific business or subsidize something else, I think that's, once again, very kind of a technocratic thing where you kind of just have to do a cost-benefit analysis as to whether or not it's likely to achieve the goal in question without really ideologically saying we need government control here or we need private sector control there. Similarly, like there's some industries like probably the postal service, electricity, water, that just kind of by their necessity need to be run by government or by a semi-public agency. And that's just kind of the reality of the situation. But sometimes as the private sector can do something better, you give it to them. But once again, I think it's very much a case-by-case basis, looking at the realities of the situation. But generally speaking, trying to do things that create good conditions for the market economy to thrive. And so when it comes to stuff like welfare, there's obviously a government place for welfare provision. Healthcare, I like things like unemployment insurance and state pensions, because I think left to their own devices, a lot of people will just not save the money. Like they just wouldn't put into something like Social Security or, well, Social Security scam, but something like the Canadian pension plan. Because I think most of the Canadian pension plan is invested in actual businesses and it generates revenue that way. So I don't think a lot of people would necessarily do that and plan ahead. So I'd rather have the government force people to fund their own retirement a little bit at a time than having to put like seniors on full welfare. I don't know, maybe that's a very paternalistic way of looking at it, but I prefer that or people funding unemployment insurance or stuff like that. Healthcare, is kind of a tricky one. I tend towards the opinion that insurance should be public, but there should be co-pays. Not enough to break the bank. I don't really know what a respectable copay would be. Like maybe $20 if you go see a doctor or something like that. Copay is obviously based on the ability of the individual to pay. But I think you need that just to, not even to recoup the money, but just to discourage frivolous use of services. Also to offset some of the costs. Because I think a lot of people in Canada don't value the type of healthcare they receive, and they clog up the system with somewhat frivolous usage because it doesn't cost them anything. So even if they have to wait a long time, there's no reason not to go on wait lists for things because it's not going to cost them any money down the road. So I think there's that. There's also things like what Japan has where government pays like 75% of the cost or something. There's the German healthcare system where insurance is public but delivery is not entirely public. There's a lot of models I don't support, like just having total free market, or even like the health savings accounts just seem kind of like a scam to me. Because I think in a lot of cases people could probably pay for things like doctor's appointments, or if they need to get a wart removed or something out of their pockets. The issue is like catastrophic things or long-term illnesses and stuff like that. I just don't think the average person would ever have enough in their health savings account to cover really big ticket expenses like that. And once again, it comes down to, this is kind of the issue where we start to talk about I have a right to this and a right to that. Well, it's good if in your society people can have a higher standard of living and they can have access to things like housing or food or water or that sort of thing. It's very much dependent upon the government's ability or your society's ability to provide things. Like in Western countries, there's no reason for people to be starving or thirsty or whatever. We have a problem with overproduction. It's well within our ability to provide for that. I think it's well within our ability to have some sort of housing solution for people who want it. Be that in mental hospitals or subsidized housing or shelters or something. I think we're wealthy enough to provide that. To a certain extent with university education, how it tends to work in Canada is people pay a significant amount of tuition, but it's capped fairly low. So like a yearly tuition might be something like $4,500 to $5,000 or something, which I think is a pretty reasonable amount because the individual is contributing a substantial amount of money. But even if a lot of that is financed with, well, we have pretty extensive student aid as well for poor people. So a lot of people will graduate with student debt, but it only might be like $10,000 to $30,000 or something at a much lower interest rate than in the US, which is something people can pay off in a couple of years or a decade without becoming debt slaves. You can even apply to have some of the debt forgiven if it's an undue financial burden. In some ways, we might be somewhat too generous, but I kind of prefer that to like the US, where it's just a giant disaster, where everything's super expensive regardless of government spending, and students are made debt slaves for the rest of their lives. A student loan debt can't be discharged, I think, under most circumstances. I'm not sure if it's all, but most circumstances during bankruptcy, student loan debt can't be discharged. So yeah. But I think that kind of summarizes my views of economics. It's very much dependent upon what the need is, how efficient something can be provided. There's a lot of other kind of moral aspects I guess I didn't get into. Like obviously there's things like safety regulations, health and safety, testing of medical products, stuff like that. And there are times when the government has to set price limits. But generally speaking, like I said, that's very dependent upon what the environment is at the time and the realities of the situation. So those are my thoughts on the matter. Hopefully that was interesting, even if they are kind of, I don't know if bland's the right term, but just kind of normie views. But yeah, God bless, and I'll talk to you guys later.